Okay, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. This webinar is focused on designing appropriate academic interventions using the taxonomy of intervention intensity. Today, we are joined by three incredible presenters, Dr. Caitlyn Majeika, the Knowledge Development Task Lead for NCII, who oversaw the first round of taxonomy brief development and publications. Prior to joining NCII, Dr. Majeika was a middle school special education teacher and an assistant professor of special education. Next, we have Dr. Aleksis Kincaid, who is the Tools Charts task lead for NCII, responsible for managing the review process used to evaluate the technical rigor of academic and behavior assessments and interventions that appear on the NCII Tools Charts. Prior to joining NCII, Dr. Kincaid worked as a school psychologist and district multi-tiered systems of support coordinator. And last, we have Dr. Kim St. Martin, the director of Michigan's MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center and director of Michigan State Personnel Development Grant. Kim has also collaborated on federally funded research projects and most recently was on the panel of the Providing Reading Interventions for Students in Grades 4 through 9 IES Practice Guide.
So I just want to provide a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with a review of data-based individualization. We'll move into an overview of the Academic Intervention Taxonomy Briefs, including how they were developed and the components within each brief. Experience from the field and using those taxonomy briefs kind of in action. And then we'll close with a question and answer session where we invite you to ask any questions you have about how you can use those briefs in your practice. After this webinar, we believe you'll be able to list 6 dimensions of the taxonomy of intervention intensity through which educators can evaluate their interventions, describe 3 ways to use the intervention taxonomy briefs when considering programs for students with intensive academic needs, and list the strengths and weaknesses of an intervention based on the dimensions of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. So we're going to start by talking about data-based individualization. And just as a reminder, we want to provide a brief overview of data-based individualization process. It's a research-based process for individualizing and intensifying interventions through the systematic use of assessment data, validated interventions, and research-based adaptation strategies. DBI makes this process systematic, explicit, and tailored to meet the needs of individual students through a multi-step process that gradually intensifies instruction and support. DBI is an ongoing process. It's not a single intervention. It's not something you can purchase. It is intended for a small percentage of students with severe and persistent learning and behavior needs, including those who are not making adequate progress in their current intervention program, which is often a tier 2 evidence-based intervention, are not meeting individualized education program goals, have persistently low academic achievement, or have high intensity or high frequency behavior. The DBI process includes 5 iterative steps. It builds on a validated intervention program that's delivered with fidelity. The validated intervention program is typically an evidence-based standard protocol intervention. So that means it's being delivered to a small group of students kind of as the publisher designed it. Step 2 is regular progress monitoring data are collected to determine whether the student is responding to the intervention. If the student is responsive, the teacher continues the intervention and monitors the student progress until they reach the expectation that we want them to reach. If the data suggests that the student is not responding, even though other students have responded to that intervention, then the teacher moves on to the 3rd step in the process, which is collecting and using informal and formal diagnostic data to determine why the student may not be responding to the intervention and forming hypotheses about what could be happening that's preventing that student from obtaining their goal. Then we move on to step 4. So the hypothesis and educator's expertise are used to develop an individual student plan for modifying or adapting the intervention to better meet the needs, the student's needs. While implementing the intervention adaptations, the teacher continues to collect progress monitoring data using the same assessment tool previously used at regular intervals to assess how well that adaptation is working for the student. It's really critical to make sure you continue to use that same assessment tool so you can compare whether or not your adaptation is supporting the student in reaching their goal. Students whose data indicate non-response return to step 3, where the teacher will analyze additional data and consider further adaptations, while students whose data indicate responsiveness continue with the adapted intervention. Today, we're going to focus on the very first step of the DBI process, which is selecting those validated intervention programs that we're going to deliver with fidelity for students. Educators who may be selecting these interventions include those like yourself. So it could be an academic coach who's identifying interventions for the district to purchase, a school MTSS team that creates a decision tree for selecting tier 2 and tier 3 interventions based on students' needs, or a teacher who selects the most appropriate intervention to address a student's individualized education program goals. When you're selecting these interventions, though, there are a lot of things to consider. So teams and individual teachers are considering, whether or not they have an evidence-based program and whether it has a large effect size for the outcome that they're working on with that student. They might be thinking about the opportunities that the student has to respond and receive corrective feedback and how well that intervention aligns with grade level standards and connects to the tier 1 instruction being provided in their classroom. They might also wonder about whether it's really adequately breaking down tasks into smaller steps and providing students with concrete learning opportunities to really build on those skills, which is just a lot for teams to consider. So it'd be really helpful if we had some sort of a framework to guide our thinking when we decide what interventions to use and how to adapt them for students. So NCII has developed kind of key considerations when selecting or evaluating validated interventions for data-based individualization. So you can think about whether the evidence suggests that the intervention is expected to lead to improved outcomes for the student in the area in which you want to intervene, whether the group size, duration, and frequency provide sufficient opportunities to respond and receive corrective feedback, whether the intervention matches the student's identified needs, and whether it assists in generalizing those learned skills from intervention back into the general education environment. Whether the intervention includes elements of explicit instruction, including modeling how to complete the task, and whether the student will have opportunities to develop the behavior skills needed to be successful, or whether they can easily integrate these skills into academic instruction, which we call behavioral support and academic supports. And lastly, whether the intervention can be individualized with a data-based process to meet the student's needs if they happen to not respond to the standard protocol approach. Based on those questions, we designed the taxonomy of intervention intensity, which includes kind of those 7 questions. So thinking about the strength, the dosage, alignment to the student's needs, the promotion of transfer, how comprehensive it is of explicit instruction, behavioral and academic support, and then individualization.
Thanks, Aleksis. I'm going to now take over and do a deep dive into the Academic Intervention Taxonomy Briefs. And before I do that, I wanted to address a couple of the questions that have come in the Q&A already. The first question was, is secondary intervention synonymous with tier 2? And the answer is yes, we are referring to tier 2 interventions. And then the second question about additional information or webinars on the other steps of DBI that we are not going into in depth today. At the end of the webinar, we will share additional resources on our website, and there you can find additional webinars we've hosted in the past, some modules, or some LMS modules that are related to the other steps of DBI if you're interested in learning more about those. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the Academic Intervention Taxonomy Briefs, which are a fairly new resource for our center. And as Eliza mentioned, I am part of NCII, and I have been here through the initial development and publication of this first round of briefs, and we are very excited to share them with you today. And if you have never heard of them or the taxonomy, we are going to give you all the information you need to decide if these are going to be a useful resource for you. And if you have heard of the taxonomy or even used the briefs, we're hoping this will help you find new and more effective and efficient ways to use them in your practice. So first, we wanted to share a little bit about why we developed the briefs and what their purpose is. We had educators in mind, and we knew they were constantly making decisions about interventions. And so we wanted to provide those educators with information they could use to evaluate the appropriateness of academic interventions that are available on our tools charts. So on our academic intervention tools charts, we have a number of reading, math, writing programs available that we've rated. And we know that educators are making decisions about what tools or interventions to use for students who require intervention. So we wanted the briefs to be a resource that educators could use alongside the tools chart to make those decisions. Another purpose of the brief was to align information about specific interventions and components along those dimensions of the taxonomy that Aleksis introduced you to. And again, if you are very familiar with this taxonomy, that the briefs will be very aligned to that. And if this all is new to you, we are going to define each of the dimensions for you today and show how the components of interventions are aligned with each dimension. We also want to share some information about how we develop the briefs. So on our academic intervention tools charts, as I mentioned, we have a number of reading and mathematics tools or interventions that vendors have submitted and are rated. We invited all vendors who are currently on the tools chart to develop a taxonomy brief using a standardized template that our team had created. The template, again, outlined the dimensions of the taxonomy and asked those vendors to provide information specific to their intervention or program. We then received those completed briefs, and our internal team at NCII, along with some external consultants and experts, reviewed those briefs for accuracy and adherence to the taxonomy. And then we allowed the vendors an opportunity to respond to our feedback before we publish these final products. You can find the briefs in two places. The first is right on the tools chart page itself. So if you are looking at the academic intervention tools chart, right above the legend is a link where you can go and access these intervention taxonomy briefs directly. You can also navigate to them using our main menu. So if you click on Tools Chart and then navigate to the Academic Intervention Chart, right under that is also another link that will take you to the homepage where the briefs will live. Here is the table of all of the briefs that we've published so far. Again, this was a voluntary submission process, so not all the tools on our tools chart will have a brief. But please note that over time, as vendors choose to develop a brief, we will add more briefs as they do become available. Here's an example of how we are anticipating the briefs can be used in practice. First, they will help educators understand the strengths and weaknesses of an intervention, and this is based along those dimensions of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. And by doing so, it will help educators evaluate the appropriateness of interventions that are on the tools chart, thinking about a specific student or group of students who require intervention. And then in turn, this will help guide decisions about the selection or purchase of a new intervention. So those of you who are in the decision-making capacity, who are making decisions about a group of students, a single student, a district of students, hoping that this will help guide your decision-making process. Each of the briefs will be on the same template and look the same, and the information for each intervention will be what is customized. So each brief will start with an introduction that will share the purpose of the briefs, what it is, and will provide a brief overview of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. So all that foundational information that you need to know to understand the briefs is right there in that introduction. Then each brief also includes program information. And this is specific features of each program. For example, the duration of each intervention session, the length of the intervention, information about the publisher or training requirements will all be in a table at the beginning of each brief as well. And then each brief will go into detail on the dimensions of the taxonomy and how components of that intervention align with the dimensions of the taxonomy. And today we are going to do our deep dive into this component. So how this next section will work is I'm going to present information about one of the dimensions of the taxonomy, and then I'm going to share an actual example or screenshot from one of our briefs to give you an example of what that information looks like and give you some questions you can consider when reviewing the briefs. So let's start with the first dimension of the taxonomy, which is strength. We want to know when selecting an intervention, how likely is this intervention going to work for students with intensive intervention needs? And we are defining students with intensive intervention needs as those students who are at or below the 20th percentile. And so we want to know, are we selecting a program that has a pretty good chance of working or being effective with this specific group of students? Okay. And so some considerations when thinking about the strength is considering if that intervention has been evaluated empirically with a scientifically sound study that's using rigorous methodology that just shows we have confidence in the results. And then if so, what are the effects of that study? How well did that intervention work for this population of students? And so for group design studies, what is reported and what we have in our briefs is the mean effect size. And we are going to use this number as, again, one component as part of our larger evaluation to help determine the strength of this intervention. So this is an example of strength right from the taxonomy brief. Okay. So here I'm just going to orient you to how we've laid out each of the sections. To start, where the green arrow is the definition of the dimension of the taxonomy. Again, just as I mentioned earlier, even if you haven't used the taxonomy before, we've embedded that information within the brief itself. Then we have some information specifically related to this component and the information that we were looking for specifically for these briefs. So for these briefs, even if a tool or a study has been used with a larger population of students, the briefs themselves are specific to students with intensive intervention needs. So again, students at or below the 20th percentile. So when considering your intervention needs, this is going to have that information for that specific population of students. And for strength, the information from vendors that they provided is in a table for you. And the table will show the domain. So this is an example of a mathematics brief for the intervention fraction face-off, and it's in the mathematics domain. There's also information if there is a subdomain. So here we're thinking about fractions and decimals. And then we're looking at the outcome measure and the effect size. So here we know that this is for students with intensive intervention needs, and we know the outcomes for a specific subdomain and outcome measure. So when you pick up a brief and are using the brief and you're looking at strength, remember the question we're asking is how well does the intervention work for students with intensive intervention needs on a specified outcome? And I also want to remind you again that each of these pieces we're describing are part of the whole picture. We are determining strengths and weaknesses, and we want to get the whole picture of an intervention. So this is an important question to keep in mind as you're reviewing the dimension of strength. So next, we're going to go to the second dimension of the taxonomy, which is dosage. And here, often with dosage, we think about time and enough time for a student to be receiving intervention is very important. But we also know that students who require intensive intervention require a larger number of opportunities to respond and receive feedback than their peers. So when selecting an intervention, it's critical that we are paying attention to the dosage. That is the number of opportunities a student has to respond and receive that corrective feedback when we're making that selection. We want to make sure that this population of students is having a sufficient number of practice opportunities during each session and across the board. And so we know that a number of areas can affect or impact the dosage of an intervention. This may mean the number or the frequency at which you provide sessions, the actual length or duration of those sessions, the student-teacher ratio, and also the number of practice problems available and provided. So even knowing this and keeping these in mind, it can be a little challenging to know, even if you have intervention materials in your hand, the actual count or number of opportunities to respond a student may have on average across an entire program. So it is a really great feature of the brief is that vendors have actually done the work to randomly select a number of lessons, calculate and count the number of opportunities to respond and provide feedback, and given you that information within the brief. So again, we're thinking how many opportunities on average does a student have to respond and receive corrective feedback? So here we know that assuming a group size of 4 students, each student in the group has about 97 opportunities to respond and receive corrective feedback. Now we'll go to the third dimension of the taxonomy, which is alignment. And we know that alignment between student need and the intervention selected is important for all students, but it is especially critical for those students with intensive intervention needs, as we want to make sure that we are hyper aligning their intervention programming with those skills they need to develop, those foundational skills, those grade level skills, to ensure that we're targeting those skills and not including too many other skills that they've already mastered in our program. So with alignment with the taxonomy, we think about this as the extent to which the intervention addresses that full set of the student's academic deficits, and that is not including or spending a lot of time on skills a student has already mastered. Okay? We really want to make sure it's hyper-focused on those skills a student needs to learn, those foundational skills. We also want to make sure that we're incorporating a focus on grade level standards. So not only thinking about the skills a student needs to learn, but also the connection with those specific grade level standards that we're expecting a student to know and demonstrate. So here's an example of a screenshot of the alignment section from the fraction face-off brief. And again, we have the definition of alignment at the top. And then here you see a table with information about alignment. So here it provides an instructional grade level. It shows the content area addressed, and then it shows the specific skills strands. So for example, in the row I've highlighted, how you can use this is that we know this is a 4th grade instructional grade level. We're focused on understanding fraction magnitude, but within fraction magnitude, this intervention is going to cover comparing fractions, ordering fractions, placing fractions on number lines, and finding fraction equivalencies. Okay. And again, this is to answer that question, does the intervention address only those target skills? The next dimension is promoting transfer. What's really important with interventions is that we are actively promoting skills that the students can use and take what they've learned in the intervention context and apply it in other settings. I'm sure a number of you have experienced a situation where in an intervention setting, a small group setting, a student has mastered a set of skills, but then that student is not able to demonstrate that same level of proficiency in their core classroom, their gen ed classroom, or a different setting with a different teacher. And so it's critical that when we are thinking about interventions, we're selecting those interventions that are purposefully weaving in opportunities for a student to learn skills and apply them to other contexts and settings. So for promoting transfer, here in general, we're thinking about generalization. And we want to know within each intervention, are we embedding in skills purposefully to help students transfer those skills to other formats and contexts? Are we purposefully and explicitly helping students connect those mastered skills and related skills? And are students able to use what they're learning in this intervention to then demonstrate success and mastery on more standardized or measures of generalization? And so to do that, what we've asked vendors to do is to provide us a summary. And you can see here with the green arrow that's pointing to the general summary of how does this intervention in general include explicit components that are going to promote transfer of skills from the intervention setting to other contexts or other type of problems or situations. And then for this section in the brief, what we've also asked vendors to do, highlighted in the green box, is to list specific activities that are examples of what the intervention includes. So here, this vendor has provided 2 activities that are included right within the intervention that are purposefully promoting transfer of the skills learned or having the students practice them in another context to help promote that generalization. And again, what's really unique about this is it really does give you information from the vendors themselves about what the intervention includes. And so even if, again, if you have materials or you don't, this is really making that explicit connection to here's what the intervention includes, here's how it promotes transfer, and you can make that decision of, is this the right fit for this student, or is it a right fit for this group of students that we may be selecting for? So next we move on to the dimension of comprehensiveness. And for comprehensiveness, we're really thinking about key principles of explicit instruction. And I'm sure you are all aware of how important explicit instruction is, and that it is a systematic way of teaching where we're purposefully selecting an objective, the teacher models the skills, the students have time for scaffolded practice, they receive feedback, they're given purposeful review, and it's really going to help that student achieve mastery. Explicit instruction is important for all students, but we know it's long been the gold standard for students with intensive intervention needs, including students with or at risk for learning disabilities. So when reviewing an intervention program, it's critical that we are assessing the extent to which we're seeing components of explicit instruction within those instructional materials. And so here we've outlined key principles of explicit instruction, so that clear, direct language to provide directions to students, modeling to students, making sure that students have adequate background knowledge and skills, making sure that students are given opportunities to practice, but then fading those supports given for feedback, making sure we have plenty of opportunities to practice, again, thinking about dosage here, and then making sure that a program is systematically incorporating that cumulative review. So these are 6 guiding principles of explicit instruction that are key when evaluating a program. What we asked vendors to do is choose the principles of explicit instruction that their intervention demonstrates. And we've asked them to provide examples of activities within that intervention that demonstrate examples. So it was one step beyond, oh, what principles of explicit instruction does your intervention include? We had them provide information about specific lessons or scopes of lessons or parts of lessons that can help provide evidence of that. So here this vendor chose the dimension of providing explanations in direct, simple language, and then gave 2 examples of activities or parts of the intervention lessons that would be examples of what that looks like. And again, when we're evaluating interventions, we're thinking in what ways does the intervention include principles of explicit instruction? The last dimension we're going to go over is behavioral support. We know that academics and behavior go hand in hand. We also know that really strong intensive intervention programs for academics are likely to include some form of behavioral support for our students. And they do this because we know that it's highly likely that students who have learning difficulties or disabilities are likely to have comorbid behavioral challenges. And so it's really important when we're intervening on academic skills that we are also considering and planning for and embedding in behavioral supports to our program to best address the needs of these students. So in the taxonomy, behavioral support for academics is a very important one of the dimensions, as it does ensure that we are comprehensively addressing the needs of the student beyond just those for the academics. And so within the taxonomy, behavioral support refers to the extent to which the interventions are incorporating self-regulation and executive function skills, while also embedding behavioral principles that are helping to minimize non-productive behavior and really help to kind of build that behavioral repertoire of students to help them engage in those expected behaviors that will set the stage and create a solid environment for learning. So behavioral support is the last dimension. And that is also found in our briefs as well. And so here we're asking the question, how does this intervention include behavioral support? Okay. Again, not just a check of does it, but specifically how. So what we asked vendors to do with this one, similar to the previous dimensions, is to provide actual examples of activities. So here the vendors are providing examples of activities within their academic interventions of how they're addressing self-regulation or executive function or helping to reduce those non-productive behaviors. So as you can see here, this vendor provides an example of a self-regulation system embedded within the intervention itself. And this really does give you an inside view of what information is provided, what you can expect from the intervention to help you better answer that question of how we can better include behavioral support within our interventions. So for this last part of the webinar, before we get to the Q&A section, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kim St. Martin. She has worked with NCII for a long time, and she's going to share some of her historical experience with the briefs using the taxonomy. So we could give you an example of someone who is using these briefs in action and has been using them for a while to better round out the information that we're sharing today. So Kim, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. So it's a gift to be with everyone to talk about the taxonomy briefs in action. And so I want to just first and foremost give a shout out to my colleagues at the MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center who've been particularly working on our efforts to intensify literacy instruction. That's a part of our state systemic improvement plan. So I do want to take a walk down a memory lane with everyone. So our love of the taxonomy briefs actually began with the taxonomy of intervention intensity academic rating rubric. So I don't think it's several years ago, a few years ago, when the academic rating rubric was released, we had the gift of being, one of the first users. And so we actually engaged in some usability testing. In collaboration, our goal was to work with schools and to really figure out what does it take to make good selections related to interventions. And so when we are guiding schools and districts, we really want to highlight the importance of having individuals at the district level who have executive leadership, decision-making authority around curriculum, intervention, selection. And you want to work with individuals at who also have content expertise. So in the example that I'm providing, I'm talking about intensifying literacy instruction. So we would want people that have a depth of understanding of the science of reading. They understand examples and non-examples of instructional practices that align with the science of reading versus do not, like the 3 cueing systems as just one example. And they work together to engage in a high quality review and selection process. And I intentionally added the word deselection because oftentimes when districts are making decisions, in this case around intervention, they have to also consider deselecting intervention curriculum resources that either do not have the evidence, that are difficult to implement for a variety of reasons. So our goal is to use the taxonomy of intervention intensity academic rating rubric to assist districts and schools in making good decisions around that first step of the database individualization process, a good standard protocol intervention for students to be able to begin their intervention instruction in. And then what we did is that we work with districts and schools to review the interventions through the lens of the taxonomy of intervention intensity. And I want to be clear, though, that this rubric is only one component of a comprehensive review. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we mean by the other components of a comprehensive review, but this kind of sets the stage for how our efforts as a technical assistance center in using these briefs in action, it began with the academic rating rubric. So a lot of our work was to engage in some usability testing. So we wanted to try out using the academic rating rubric with some other selection guidance that we provide districts and schools. And so we wanted to really answer a couple of questions. How helpful was the rubric in informing intervention selection? How easy was it to use? And what additional support might schools and districts or the users benefit from having? So here were our usability testing results. We found in using the rubric that access to intervention teacher resources could be difficult at times. To really look at things like comprehensiveness, dosage, alignment, you need to get your hands on the materials. And so we acknowledge that this could be hard for districts and schools to actually borrow. We would hate to see them purchase if they weren't going to invest in something. So access to the materials to be able to engage in the high quality review related to the dimensions of intervention intensity, we saw as something that could be problematic. And so what we did was we had an opportunity to work with our colleagues at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. And we actually helped guide, we gave a suggestion, and it was affirmed even by some of the leading authors of the academic rating rubric, that it would be nice if curriculum developers, publishers could supply information related to each of those dimensions that could help schools and districts, the individuals who are in charge of curriculum and intervention review and selection. It could do it could take care of some of the legwork. It really could help them be able to get easy access to information to inform a good selection. What we also found is that background knowledge is important as well. So it's helpful to have background knowledge about each of the dimensions of intervention intensity, how to score the rubric accurately. So for example, what do the dimensions mean? How do you discern what's present in the intervention materials? In this case, using the taxonomy briefs, we would look at what was supplied by the publisher, the curriculum developer, and be able to look at that information relative to what's in the rubric to inform a rating. So some considerations that we always provide to the districts and schools that we're working with is, number one, we've got to remember that publishers and program developers, they have submitted these existing briefs. You've heard that said. So we have to be cautious. I mean, we have to be good consumers, and you've got to be able to read what's in the briefs, think about what you know from the research, and use your content expertise to be able to then take that information and apply it to the academic rating rubric. You also have to consider that there are effective intervention curriculum resources that have not been submitted to be included on the academic intervention tools chart. So therefore, they may not even have a completed taxonomy brief. And the point is, that's okay. So we certainly didn't want people to think, if there isn't a brief or if something isn't showing up on the academic tools chart, should we not even consider it in the first place? And our answer is, no, that please don't view it in that way. Be a good consumer. You leverage your individuals with content expertise and use some additional guidance around review and selection, including the taxonomy of intervention intensity, academic rating rubric, to help inform your decisions. Many people also in the country are using the hexagon tool. So our colleagues at the National Implementation Research Network have published the hexagon tool that also is a way to be able to inform review and selection and deselection of curriculum resources, assessments, any type of innovation or evidence-based practice. So within the state of Michigan, we do use the hexagon tool, and we see a purpose still for the hexagon tool and the academic rating rubric. When you're thinking about what's on the taxonomy brief, the information that's supplied on the taxonomy brief really starts to get at some of the program indicators that are on the hexagon tool. So it talks about evidence. It talks about the types of supports like professional development that would be needed. I had clicked on one of the taxonomy briefs, the PACT intervention, for example, and it talked about 10 hours of professional learning was recommended for teachers. That type of information, if you were using the hexagon tool, would show up in the supports component of the program indicators of those 3 pieces of the hexagon tool that are getting at the program, the indicators to talk about the quality of the program that you're considering. The academic rating rubric, though, does allow for a more nuanced review and selection because it really does get into each of those dimensions. So you're looking at the intervention curriculum resource through the lens of dosage, through the lens of alignment, through comprehensiveness, attention to transfer, behavioral supports. Those nuances don't necessarily appear in some of the program indicators of the hexagon tool and don't even appear overtly in some of the implementation site indicators. So the big takeaway from my perspective is that the taxonomy of intervention briefs are helpful in doing some of the legwork and being able to summarize critical information about intervention curriculum resources related to each of those dimensions of intervention intensity. And it is a part of a comprehensive review and selection process. We want district leaders who have decision-making authority over curriculum resources to be a part of that, in addition to individuals at the school who have content expertise, who are very much guiding and working with teachers and leaders and being able to intensify intervention supports. So with that said, I am now going to turn it over for 15 minutes of Q&A.
Thanks, Kim.
All right, we've got a few questions that are coming in the chat, and just a reminder, if you've thought of any questions throughout the presentation, to add those in now. So I'll start with this first question that is kind of going off a bit of what Kim was talking about. Do teams have to make these decisions, or can individual teachers, and how might that look different, or is there any guidance for, if an individual is wanting to use these versus a group?
Does anyone want to take that first, or?
You can go first, Kim, then
Okay.
we can round it out.
So I think there's 2 levels of intervention selection. So the piece that I talked a lot about was districts and schools are looking to develop an intervention platform. So they're looking at a core set of intervention curriculum resources that could be the platform by which any student school-wide who needs to access intervention can certainly access. However, there's an individual student element to this too. So you've got students, in this case, we're talking about students with significant and persistent needs, and student needs a very specific intervention. There is, at that point, the time in which you've got to consider a selection for that individual student. And you could start by considering what's already on the district's intervention platform, but now you've got to make an individual student decision and ensure that the alignment is there. And you would go through those dimensions to inform a decision to say, is this going to be the best first step for delivering, for providing intervention instruction that would begin the database individualization process. I'm curious, Caitlyn or Aleksis, is there anything you would add based on what I had said?
No, I think that's great. And I also think there are contextual factors. There are some school districts or settings where a team-based approach is how they make decisions as a district for curriculum. They make decisions in the DBI process. They make decisions for students receiving intensive intervention. I think you also have some school contexts where there are the resources look different and the teams look different, and you may be working with a virtual team and you may be the only special educator in your building. So I think that we do describe this team-based approach that is appropriate, and there is this level of individual student selection, but the materials that we're presenting can be used by an individual teacher if that's what kind of you have what you're working with.
Aleksis, anything to add?
No, I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. We've got a few questions. I know, Caitlyn, you spoke to this a little bit about kind of the process of working with the vendors on the tools charts. And, you know, is there a process of having to encourage vendors to submit and how you work with them kind of throughout this process?
Sure. So the tools charts have been around for decades now. And so we have a lot of long-standing relationships with vendors, and a lot of them are very excited to receive the information for this briefs and to be able to present more and different information about their tools with the field. So when we sent out the information, we had a lot of positive response from the vendors who were very excited to partner with us to be able to share and highlight pieces of their curriculum for the users of the tools chart. But again, this is voluntary. We ran it on a cycle, and so not all of them were able to submit this round. And if they weren't, a lot of them did note that they would like to be considered in the future. So just as we have ongoing calls for new tools to be added to our tools chart, we will continue to work with vendors and encourage them to submit their tools to the tools chart along with a brief as well.
And then I'm seeing a question kind of around family engagement, whether anyone has suggestions on how to include families in this process and how educators might share some of this information back with parents and families.
Yeah, I can start. I think what's really great about the taxonomy itself and with the briefs is that it really does outline, kind of along with the DBI process, a decision-making process and tools to help schools make decisions. And so as a school, if you are communicating with families about resources you've selected or new intervention programs, these materials can be used to help communicate to families how you've made this decision. Again, having to think about that through the lens of a family and making sure the language we're using kind of mirrors their experiences, but these can help provide a really nice outline and really nice features that when you are presenting to families and sharing information of how you came to these decisions.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to is that, I think two-way communication with families is absolutely essential. And, we are working with parents and caregivers as partners. From a secondary space, I'll give you a recent example. I was working with an administrator that it really engaged families and caregivers in understanding what the middle school was doing to provide intervention, because given the scheduling constraints, students were receiving reading intervention in lieu of an elective. And that was a mutual decision with the parent caregiver, the student, and the school. And it required shared understanding of the interventions that were being provided, the benefits of students accessing the interventions, the frequency in which they were. So think about dosage, right? Think about the comprehensiveness of it. And, I can't say enough that parents and caregivers are partners in this process. And it's more than just sending a letter saying, notifying a family member that your child is receiving intervention.
All right, I think we have time for one more. I see a question on, folks are wondering about any briefs on behavior or social emotional learning, or you spoke a little bit about the importance of integrating behaviors in academics, but more specifically targeted to behavior.
Sure, that's a really great question, as they all have been. So we do have a taxonomy specific to behavior interventions that is on our website. And we are this year in the development of considering the implications for briefs specifically related to behavior, social, emotional, behavioral wellness supports. So the short answer would be stay tuned for more. We are, again, as you noted, we value the importance of integrating the academic and behavior interventions. And so we do have that component, but we also know that there are some specific behavioral interventions that schools use or are making decisions about. And so we will be gathering our leadership team at NCII and making some decisions specifically related to behavior and the behavior briefs this year. And we will share them with the field as soon as we can.
Can I add something about this too?
Of course, yes.
I'm saying too much. So someone asked earlier, or in one of the questions about, more training around the steps of the DBI process. I want to share this because it speaks to the importance of integration of academics and behavior. So in some of the work that we're doing within our state, in implementing DBI, and we have framed that around the advanced tiers 2 and 3 of an MTSS framework. And when it comes to the intensification process, so you would think of students who are not responding to the intervention instruction as we would have anticipated, the adaptation to the intervention, what we're finding is that consistently, after we've ruled out whether or not the intervention is being delivered with fidelity, of all of those dimensions of intervention intensity, so dosage, alignment, comprehensiveness, attention to transfer, behavior supports, the one that we have to address first, because we're doing a frequency count on this and keeping track, is behavioral supports. So we've actually gotten to a point where we have prioritized the dimensions based on the dimensions that require the least amount of resources to address versus the most amount of resources. And consistently, we're seeing the need to ramp up and design an intervention group intensification plan, in addition to some individual intensive intervention plans that focus on behavioral supports. So I just want to give a nod to what Caitlyn was saying, because we absolutely have to integrate the academic and the behavioral supports.
Great. Thank you, Kim. That was really great to round out an awesome question and answer session. And we appreciate all of you attending today and those really great questions you asked. We are going to do closing and wrap up. We'll start with some key takeaways. We just want to emphasize that we know that no intervention is going to be perfect. And so we're providing tools and procedures to help you make your decisions and to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of a program. And we also want to, again, highlight that these briefs that are available on our website can be used to evaluate the appropriateness of an intervention for student or group of students, knowing that interventions may be appropriate for one group, but maybe not another one. So really, how can we make those decisions based on individual student needs or groups of students? Eliza has been sharing resources in the chat. But again, we wanted to share some other resources and information. These will be embedded within the slides that we will post on our website, along with a recording for this webinar and related resources. But we do have our tools chart, our taxonomy of intervention intensity, and the actual briefs all linked here and will be embedded in the slides as well. So you can access all of those resources. And with that, we want to say thank you. We can be found at intensiveintervention.org. We also have an email address if you have additional questions or want to follow up on anything that we didn't have an opportunity to answer today. But that's it for us. Thank you all for your time. We appreciate you being here with us today.